Showdown at Warg-Tooth Crossing, Chapter 16. Kale stood on the street in front of the horny toad. His noontime shadow was stark and short in the muddy ground, and a small breeze pulled at his hat. He drew it down to keep it on and stared up past the brim. His weight was to one side against his hip, and his hands rested easy in his sword belt. To all who were peering through various windows, and there were many, his challenge was clear. The door to the toad opened and 4 men came out one at a time. Red, Jarrus, and another man, still nameless to Kale, spread out in a line 20 feet away. Bull brought up the rear, slowly stepping down the toad's porch steps. "I'll say one thing," Bull chuckled, shaking his head. "You do have an enormous set of balls on you. Might be lacking in brains a smidge, though." Kale just smiled, though the smile didn't reach his eyes. One of them ticked, but he steadfastly ignored it. Bull continued, "I can't rightly tell what happened 5 nights ago. Doesn't much matter, because I'm sure as hell going to finish this now. I don't have any more time to waste on you, Kale. Boys," Bull spoke to the henchman, "you know what to do." Bull started turning back up the steps as the men stepped forward. Kale called out, "Ain't you even a little curious why I came back?" Bull paused, and the men stopped, turning to look at him. Something about the way Kale talked didn't make sense, and they waited for instructions. "I can't figure why you do most of the things you do, Kale. I'm sure you had your reasons, but like I said, I got no more time to waste." "I can appreciate that, you being a businessman and all nowadays," Kale called out. "But what I have to tell you directly affects your business. It won't take me long. Then you can do as you wish." "I can do as I wish right now, Kale," Bull said, coming back down the stairs. "True enough," Kale admitted. "But what did your scouts tell you about the wagon bringing up your somat?" Bull put his hands on his hips and stared intently. Kale continued, "I have news from the Scaly village. That's where I've been the last few days. Your call." Bull looked up at the clear blue sky and shook his head again. He waved his men to stand fast. He looked at Kale and said, "All right, Kale, let's hear what you have to say before we put an end to you." Kale pulled his coat tight around himself and struggled against the driving snow. It was late, dark, and cold, and he knew that he and Raider wouldn't make it unless he found shelter. Fortunately, he knew exactly the place. Raider seemed to read his mind and picked his way along the southern trail, finding the right turnoffs. Kale patted the horse's icy mane in appreciation and affection as he saw the shack he had built come into view. He hadn't been back to his land in quite some time, and he was happy just to see the shack and stable still standing. He dismounted Raider and led the animal to the stable where at least he would be out of the wind. Kale got his saddle off, then got some good wood together to start a fire in a little stone pit he'd made for the purpose. He rubbed down Raider as the fire got going and slapped his arms against his sides to warm himself up. He went to the well, and fortunately the bucket and rope were still in place. The pail broke the surface of the ice and came up with precious water. It was full of ice chunks, though, so Kale retrieved an iron cookpot from the shack and warmed the water over the fire. He gave the horse melted water to drink and some old hay to eat. Raider seemed to be doing well, and Kale was satisfied he'd have a mount to complete this trip. Kale looked around outside. It was unlikely Bull's men would ride this far looking for him in this weather, but then again you never knew. Bull could be quite persuasive. Also, would they even think to look for him here? It seemed too obvious, so Kale should avoid it, but then again, that was the exact reason Kale chose it, plus the fact it was more or less on his way, and he needed the shelter badly. There were a lot of twists in this thinking, and Kale decided to put it to rest. He went into the shack and built a large fire in the hearth. Warming himself and eating a cold meal from the bread and jerky he'd taken from Eris, he figured out his plan. Putting some more logs on the fire to keep it burning into the night, he went out to the stable and propped himself in the hay where he could see across the yard to the shack. With any luck, if any of the men came, they'd see the smoke and expect he was in the shack and break in there first. That should give him time to wake up and react. He got out his crossbow and made sure it was cocked, ready, and sitting beside him. He then threw a couple blankets over himself and drifted into a restless sleep. He faded in and out of sleep all night, always casting a watchful eye over the yard, but nothing moved. The first light of morning brought a change in the weather. The snow had stopped, and it was definitely warmer. Kale thanked the gods for small favors, and quietly got Raider saddled and ready. The steady horse seemed well rested enough, and soon Kale was southbound again. He kept an eye out for pursuit to his back, but if they were there, he didn't see them. The snow began melting in the thaw, and in time the clouds gave way to that brilliant late winter sun. It forced him to squint as Raider made good progress along the trail, and still there was no one to be seen. Eventually he began to turn more of his attention forward. Somewhere up ahead was the party that had been tasked to do the trade with the Scalies. They had left early the day after Kale was thrown in jail. It was hard to tell how the weather had affected their progress, but they should be somewhere up ahead. Kale stayed watchful. He was almost 2/3 of the way when the sun began setting. Kale went off the trail and found a rock outcropping to hide himself and Raider behind for the night. The snow had mostly melted, but their tracks were visible in the mud. No help for that. But he couldn't build a fire, meaning it would be a cold night. He remembered to check for scorpion lairs, then took care of Raider and bedded down. Morning brought more clear and warm weather, and Kale took to the trail quickly. This day passed much as the last with good progress, but in the early afternoon, as he came to within a few miles of the Scaly village, he thought he spotted something on the trail. He quickly dismounted and found cover for himself and Raider and waited. Sure enough, it was the exchange party returning. There were only 4 of them, 3 mounted and 1 driving the wagon with his horse tied behind. They seemed carefree and enjoying the favorable change in weather, since he could hear their joking and carrying on from a distance across the prairie. Kale decided that if he were really going to go all the way with his plan for the Somat, it should start with this shipment right here. He made ready his crossbow. His cover was a small runoff ditch where he'd secreted Raider. Kale perched on the edge behind some prairie grass. Not the ideal shooting solution, since he was looking slightly up, but it would have to do. He rubbed his ticking eye and concentrated. At 50 yards he let fly into the leading rider. The bolt flew true into his chest, and he slumped over onto the neck of his horse, then fell off. The others stopped as they looked around, unsure of what had happened. That gave Kale time to recock and fire again, this time at the second nearest rider. The rider wheeled at the last moment, so the bolt took him in the right arm. He yelped out in pain and dismounted, yelling for the others to dismount as well. The 3 men took cover, knowing that whoever was attacking them was to their front, off to the left. No one had spotted him yet, so Kale slid down, back into the ditch to recock. Slowly poking his head up over the ditch, he ducked back down quickly. The 3 men had fanned out and were almost 20 yards away, closing on him fast. 2 held longbows at the ready, and the 3rd man, the injured one, held a dagger in his left hand. Kale took off his hat and put it on the end of a stick. He held it out as far from himself as he could and raised it over the edge of the ditch. 2 arrows immediately flew by the hat. Kale dropped the stick and stood up with the crossbow. He fired into one of the men who was reaching to reload and scored a direct hit on his chest. Kale saw the other longbowman scrambling in his quarrel for another arrow. Kale gambled and took the time to recock his crossbow. Just as the man was knocking his arrow, Kale let fly and put him down. The remaining man, it was Pletz, took advantage of the time to run at Kale. With no time to recock, Kale tossed the crossbow aside and drew his sword as Pletz used his momentum to jump for him. Kale easily evaded to the side, and Pletz tumbled down the hill, coming up immediately on his feet. His eyes widened when he recognized Kale, which might have been the reason for his fatal split-second hesitation. Kale took advantage and ran Pletz through with his sword before the man could even try to parry. Kale yanked out his blade as Pletz fell to the ground and delivered the mercy blow of cutting off his head. Kale quickly checked the other men, finding them all dead. He retrieved his bolts and checked the bodies. He found some gold, which he pocketed, and some supplies which he added to the saddlebags on Raider. With flint and tinder, he got a fire going, then set the wagon alight, destroying the somat. The smoke flew high into the afternoon sky, and he knew it would bring attention. There was still no sign of pursuit behind him, though, which meant just the Scalies to the front. Maybe the wagon fire could end up being a diversion, bringing some of them to investigate. Kale rode off the trail and tried to stay low in the defiles as he approached the Scaly settlement. When he could see the smoke of their fires, he dismounted and hid with Raider to wait for the cover of darkness. From his position, he could see groups of Scalies moving about, with one group moving up the trail, probably to investigate the smoke from the wagon, which was still just visible in the northern sky. Thankfully, they hadn't spotted Kale. He absently fed Raider some feed and gave him some water from his canteen, from which he took a few gulps himself. He fingered the stone Eris had given him through his pocket and retrieved the tied pack of powder. As the sun finally dropped below the horizon, he left Raider tied up and then approached the village, hunching over to stay hidden. It was much as he remembered it from before. He moved in from just beside the trail, keeping out of sight. He approached so close to the Scaly dwellings that he could hear their sibilant language as they spoke, and see them walking around doing their business. There were a few fires, but not much seemed to be happening, and the Scalies appeared mostly to be getting ready to bed down for the night. No time like the present, Kale thought. Carefully extracting the stone, he held it between his thumb and forefinger, then flung it at the ground like a dart. Immediately, he saw the same green and orange from before, but it resolved itself into a huge green dragon's head belching fire. Then the entire body of the dragon seemed to be standing over him, and it roared, casting flame into the sky. Kale was impressed. Not only was the detail and motion of the dragon illusion accurate, but the roaring sound actually shook his insides. The Scalies were even more impressed. They screamed in terror, running about madly, scrambling southbound to get as far away from the dragon as they could. Scalies poured out of their mounds. Scalies dropped what they were doing. Scalies grabbed their children and ran for their lives. Seizing the opportunity, Kale ran forward, staying to the shadows. None of the Scalies noticed him as he worked his way back behind the mounds to where he had wandered off the time before. He was relieved to see the water running, and the somat field covered just as before. He slinked upstream to where the river had a channel diverted off and brought out the bag of powder. He slowly shook it into the flowing water, letting it dissolve as the water carried it away. He was very mindful to keep his head away from the powdery mist he created as he gently shook the bag. He looked around fitfully and was happy to see not a Scaly in sight. They had all crossed the river and were well south of him now. But they would eventually figure out the illusion, since the dragon was roaring up a storm but not advancing. His ticking eye did not make this any easier. Finally, Kale came to the last of the powder, and he flung the empty bag into the channel, then washed his hands quickly upstream. He kept to the shadows again as he went from mound to mound to get back to Raider. As he came around the corner of a mound, though, he ran straight into a Scaly warrior. It was surprised, but only briefly. With a hiss, it launched at Kale, reaching with both claws. But Kale was faster. He drew his dagger from his leg sheath, and thrusting it up with both hands and his elbows out, he deflected the claws while ramming the dagger home into the Scaly's brain pan. It spasmed in its death throes, and Kale retrieved the dagger to keep moving. But a noise from behind made him realize he'd been spotted. He turned and saw the chief and his guards returning to the center of the village. They were looking up at the dragon, but were no longer impressed. One pointed to Kale and yelled in the Scaly tongue. Stealth was definitely not an option anymore, and Kale made to run. But he thought back to that first time seeing Sliggeth in Bull's office and stood fast. "Screw you, you Scaly piece of shit," he said, as he reached to draw his crossbow. His right hand found the handle, it came loose from the sheath, and he brought the stock smoothly to rest in his left hand while taking a bead with his right eye. His breath paused, and the bolt was loosed and found its mark through Sliggeth's sloping reptilian forehead. All this happened before the guards could take 2 steps. They recoiled as they saw their chief slump over, and Kale used the time to replace the crossbow and start to run like hell. Speed was his main objective, and thankfully the illusion was still in place, illuminating the rough ground. Kale sped towards Raider, seeing the horse from a distance, and whistled to warn him he was coming. He ripped the reins off the sagebrush he'd wrapped them on, and took off while still swinging into the saddle. The sounds of angry pursuit died away, and he forced himself to slow Raider down to avoid stumbling into a hole. Eventually, he brought Raider back onto the trail, figuring any scaly this far north wouldn't know what just happened in the village and would let him pass. As he got closer to where he'd left the burning wagon, he moved off the trail again and walked beside Raider. He found another defile and secured the horse while moving from shadow to shadow. The embers of the wagon fire were still glowing orange and providing enough light to see the 4 scaly warriors that had come north on the trail to investigate the smoke. They had found the bodies of the men Kale had killed and were looking them over when a search party of 5 men rode up. Kale shook his head in wonder. These must have been the men searching for him. They were certainly persistent. Good thing the weather had slowed them down enough to keep them a good half day behind him. Still, that had been a close thing, Kale mused. Kale hunched even lower. He definitely did not want either of these groups knowing he was there. Kale perked his ears up when he heard some shouting and hissing. Suddenly, one of the men drew his sword, and from horseback sliced through one of the scaly's necks. Kale watched as a crazed melee, in the dimming light, erupted and played out. Within minutes, all the scalies were dead, and one of the men lay unmoving, and the other was injured. They put the dead man on his horse and helped the injured man. They now looked closely over the other men who had been killed previously. There was some heated discussion and arm-waving. Kale figured they must be discovering the bolt wounds his crossbow had made in 3 of the men. Scalies didn't use crossbows since their claws weren't dexterous enough. He looked around furtively, then saddled up and rode back north. And so, I followed them, Kale continued, finishing off his accounting. Always staying out of sight, of course. They were scared, so they rode through most of the night, rested a bit, then rode all the next day, arriving here last night. I assume they told you the whole story, Bull. Well, they didn't. Well, they told all they knew, Kale. They figured you'd killed the men. They didn't tell me any of this tall tale of yours about the Toth-Somat fields, not to mention this dragon illusion. Bull began laughing, and the men in front laughed along with him. No joke, Bull. The Somat field is gone. Sliggeth is dead, and the Scalies will find their dead warriors killed by your men. Your trading days with them are done. So you say. Bull stopped laughing. Bull, there is no reason for you to stay. The folks here just want to live in peace, or failing that, at least be able to defend themselves. I'm asking you politely, respectfully, to just please leave. Well, Kale, I'm touched, but I'm not going anywhere. I have to admit, I'm at somewhat of a loss as to why most of my crew are sleeping so soundly that they can't be awakened. I assume you had something to do with that, you and a certain bar wench I'm going to deal with. Bull looked back towards the toad. But what's broken can be fixed, and we'll get the trade going again. So, thanks for the story, Kale, but time's up. Boys? The 3 men drew their swords and advanced on Kale.